first thank our host, the famous Portuguese pianist, Adriano Jordão. It was an honor to have him here. Madam Director, Dean of the Faculty of Human Sciences of the Catholic University, dear trustees of the Lisbon Consortium, dear guest speakers, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. Latency often refers to a condition of that which escapes notice, but I will start by referring to what is noticeable. Let me begin my introductory remarks by telling the rector of the Catholic University of Portugal, Professor Maria da Glória Garcia, how deeply grateful we are to have her open this year's Lisbon Summer School for the Study of Culture. Though the topic of this year's event is latencies, I must say that neither literally nor conceptually is the privilege of your presence with us here today latent. Indeed, our joy is not latent, it is tangible, present, and real. We recognize your leadership in support of the arts and humanities at the university and feel very honored to have you amongst us. My next thanks go to Dean Serdica and to the Faculty of Human Sciences at UCP. The Lisbon Summer School is a collective effort that has, over the past 4 years, mobilized faculty, doctoral students, and staff to work for the common goal of promoting an international network of knowledge in the field of culture, which has garnered constant backing from the school. The launching of this year's summer school takes place at a space that ideally incorporates the very notion of latency. The São Carlos National Theatre has not only witnessed, but also intervened in the changes of not the short, but really the long 20th century in Portugal. This is a venue where European art has taken place. From Camille Saint-Saëns, Leon Cavallo, Serge Diaghilev, to Richard Strauss or Karl Böhm, amongst many, many others, the theatre welcomed along the century the highest representatives of European creativity. With its colorful history, the National Opera House substantiates the ideas of emergence, transition, repression, delay, and revelation that are also key to understand the very notion of latency. I wish to thank our host, the São Carlos National Theatre and its board of directors for welcoming us here. This year, the summer school is jointly convened with 2 partner networks, the PhD Net in Literary and Cultural Studies, which brings together 6 European doctoral programs in the field of culture from Germany, Finland, Sweden, Italy, Austria, and us in Lisbon, and the European Summer School in Cultural Studies network that brings together faculty and students from the University of Copenhagen, the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis, the International Graduate Center for the Study of Culture at Gießen, the Université Paris 8, the University of Ljubljana, the University of Trondheim, Birkbeck College, and the Lisbon Consortium. I wish on this occasion to warmly greet our co-organizers and partners in knowledge, the faculty and students of the 2 networks. Welcome once again to Lisbon. The idea behind the Lisbon Summer School has always been one of providing a challenging environment for emerging scholars by fostering an intellectual dialogue with key thinkers in the field. The set of scholars who have gracefully accepted our invitation this year is impressive, and we at the Lisbon Consortium are particularly grateful for once again having with us the real bibliography in the flesh. The Lisbon Consortium is a knowledge network that gathers the postgraduate programs in culture studies at UCP with the Lisbon Municipality, the Gulbenkian Foundation, Culturgest, the Lisbon Oceanarium, the Orient Foundation, the Portuguese Cinematheque, the National Center for the Promotion of Culture, and the National Theatre Museum. The network is furthermore sponsored by the Millennium Foundation and the Luso-American Foundation, whose representative I want to greet very warmly. And the Luso-American Foundation has this year provided stipends for American doctoral students to attend this event. A special welcome is thus due to the Board of Trustees and to the sponsors of the Lisbon Consortium. Finally, but certainly not least, let me thank the Dream Team, the amazing staff of the Lisbon Consortium, the executive coordinator of the network, Paulo de Campos Pinto, my colleagues in the steering committee, Alexandra Lopes and Pira Hannenberg, our R&D assistant, Daniela Agostinho, our secretaries, Cristina Nunes and Elizabeth Carvalho, the marketing team, the secretary and the assistant at SEC, Sonia Pereira, as well as Inês Romba and Inês Carrão. And last but not least, of course, the students will make sure that no one is left behind. And now, on to latency. I will start with a quote that many of you will recognize immediately. There was a depression over the Atlantic. It was traveling eastwards, towards an area of high pressure over Russia, and still showed no tendency to move northwards around it. Interruption? In short, to use an expression that describes the facts pretty satisfactorily, even though it is somewhat old-fashioned, it was a fine August day in the year of 1913. Unquote. Many of you have certainly recognized the opening lines of the first volume in Robert Musil's novel, Man Without Qualities. This seismic opening describes a sort of atmospheric tension leading up to effective numbness. The expression that seems to describe the facts pretty satisfactorily, that it was indeed a fine August day, in fact suggests the shortcomings of factography, the writing of facts. In fact, Musil is less interested in describing the weather than in writing about energies lurking beneath the surface of this summer bliss. The uncompleted novel, which Musil began in 1930, is a testimony of latency, of the ominous anticipation of that which was to be named the last summer of the century before the catastrophe. But it is also an essay about the conditions of modernity in the 1930s. Latency, or better, latencies, are everywhere in Musil's novel. The theme of the 2014 Lisbon Summer School for the Study of Culture, Latencies, Europe 1914-2014, takes latency as a keyword of the present. As Anselm Haverkamp has insightfully shown in his Figura Cryptica, latency is a cultural form that pervades the very structure of aesthetic production. It is indeed a cryptical figure that lurks, hides, and seeks to escape notice. The notion of latency, then, presupposes a certain cryptology, that is, a closed space with no entry and from which there is no exit. And yet, if, as Derrida claims, the crypt is the safe of desire, the cryptic enclosure also suggests a desire for exteriority. What is hidden wants to emerge. The question is, through which means and whose agency? From the Latin latere, what lies hidden, latency has over the centuries made a career in distinct areas of experience. In acoustics, latency refers to the interference which occurs in the delay between stimulation and response. Latency, in aesthetics, Hansel Haverkamp has traced latency back to Ovid's Metamorphoses. In the Pygmalion myth, Ovid describes the concept of artistic creation itself as a suggestion of latency. Galatea, the marble statue sculpted by Pygmalion and later transformed into a woman, speaks to the ways in which art hides its own material origin. Just as Pygmalion forgets the origin of Galatea as labored art, so does art dwell on the suggestion of a mythical origin and on the erasure of technical mediation. Art, Haverkamp argues, rests on a strategy of hiding its own technique. It functions out of latency and through latency. Despite being encrypted in art as a hidden signifier, latency seeks to explode that very containment. And this is very obvious in contemporary art. This means that the work of latency always involves some kind of repression and the desire to escape it. In the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Sigmund Freud describes latency as the 4th stage in the child's psychosexual development, which usually takes place between the ages of 6 and 14. A stage which is marked by deferral of reproductive functions as they are redirected to other ends, mainly through the work of repression. Latency, however, evokes opposing mental forces, one directed towards a pleasure that is perceived as perverse and thus necessarily repressed by the other force. The previous examples speak to the ways in which the dichotomous movements of repressing and struggling, of hiding and disclosing, of delaying and making present, mark the cultural work of latency. This continuous struggle is simultaneously ontological, as in Ovid, and psychological. It is, however, also social, cultural, and historical. Freud already spoke to the advantages of using latency for cultural/civilizational ends, mainly by emphasizing the repressive mode and its effect in the production of moral prescriptions such as shame or disgust. Then again, the different theories of latency emphasize its connection with time. Latency is also Latenzzeit, time of latency. That is, it occurs over time and brands time. It speaks to a deferral of cultural energies with an impact on the awareness of the present, on the construction of the past, and on the projection of the future. Latency is then a timely concept, both literally and metaphorically. It defines a certain Stimmung, a certain feel of today, to borrow one of Samuel Weber's expressions, that contentiously reflect emerging energies. Arguably, the rise of latency as a cultural concept in the humanities, particularly after 2002, addresses also the growing uneasiness regarding the possibility of agency in a world suddenly faced with the imminence of new and astounding forms of destruction. Studies adapting the idea of latency to cultural analysis, such as the books by Haverkamp, Latenzzeit, and Hans-Ulrich Gomprecht's After 1945, Latency as Origin of the Present, draw on the assumption that we are still heirs to the energies that submerged at the end of World War II and have latently been marking social and cultural development over the past 70 years. It is furthermore claimed that latency not only marks the overwhelming mood of cultural and social theory after 1945, but has in fact become the 0 hour, the Stunde Null, of culture studies in the German tradition, of cultural analysis, of the Kulturwissenschaften. What are the effects of such thinking? Are we the heirs of the containment that occurred in the wake of the Second World War? And who are the we in this equation? Particularly when Haverkamp claims in Latenzzeit that almost, if not all, of the post-war's intellectual developments still today bear the mark of World War II and possibly of the Holocaust. What does it do to us who came after, the so-called Nachgekommenen? As a cultural concept, then, latency also speaks to the crisis of modern subjectivity, and not only from the standpoint of war. Many intellectual traditions born in the post-war period, arguably many intellectual traditions born in the post-war period, the methodological approaches, in fact, that have structured cultural analysis, from Gauss and Gadamer's reception theory to Luhmann's system theory to Lotman's defense of culture as explosion, and even the focus on collective modes of class and identity formation with Richard Hogarth, Raymond Williams, and the Birmingham School, in fact, stress the system as the trigger of social and cultural transformation, and they speak to a subjectivity in crisis. What matters is the system, not so much the actor. The stress on processes and on emergence, moreover, which is a topic that is very often comes together with latency, also obscure not only subjectivity, but also responsibility. As Michel Foucault insightfully wrote, no one is responsible for an emergence. No one can glory in it, since it always occurs in the interstice. And who, is it fair to say, is responsible for latency? In 2014, we memorialized the long 20th century and the original catastrophe that began its atrocious course. But we are also living trying times, when Europe is faced with enormous cultural and political trials, threatened with dissent and strife. Our challenge over this week is thus to address the possibilities of latency as a cultural concept, to discuss latencies throbbing in the immensely rich landscape of the European past and how they impact on the present. But it is also to think about Europe as latency, that is both as desire, which will by definition never be completely accomplished, and as repression. Ultimately, and considering the meta field of culture studies, we challenge you all to think about the work of art and culture in the seismic articulation of our Latenzzeit. Let us begin.